Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring genius, creativity, and exceptional intelligence. With me is neuropsychiatrist Dr. Vernon Neppe, who is the director of the Pacific Neuropsychiatric Institute in Seattle. He is also the author of Reality Begins with Consciousness, which he wrote with physicist Edward Close, and he has, in addition, published over 700 scientific papers, many of them on the topic we'll be discussing today. Welcome, Vernon.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
I should mention, and I didn't mention, that you are the psychometric supervisor for the International Association for Philosophical Inquiry.
Yeah, the International Society for Philosophical Inquiry, yes.
Which is an organization for people of exceptional intelligence.
Yeah, 1 in 1,000 statistically.
Mm-hmm. And so the whole question of how do you measure exceptional intelligence is obviously of great interest to an organization like that.
It is, yes.
Mm-hmm. People have to, I assume, take tests in order to be admitted.
Yeah, it's based on intelligence testing, which they call IQ testing, or is commonly referred to. And it's a little bit of a problem before one begins, because when you're dealing with the outskirts of intelligence, for example, a little over 3 standard deviations above the norm, which is equivalent to the 1 in 1,000 level. It's difficult to have statistical norms already. And already there are variations in terms of errors in scoring, which are higher than if one is dealing with the usual basis of intelligence, such as a mean IQ of 100, which has its own problems in and of itself.
Well, I guess for starters, it seems as if some of the really outstanding people in history, the great creative geniuses, might not have scored so high. Like, we hear stories of Einstein, who didn't speak until he was 4 years old.
Yes, and of course the question comes up, at what point does one test the person and what it really refers to? And then there is another series of many confounding factors, one of which is if one is very creative, one might answer items in a different way, which would lower one's scores. And the classic example might be the Nobel physicist Richard Feynman, who is reputed to have scored only an IQ of 125. We don't even know what the standard deviation was there, but if that was so-called 15, which is one of the statistical measures, we're dealing with just 1 2/3 standard deviations above the norm. He would not even qualify for a high IQ organization, but certainly not an exceptional IQ organization such as Mensa.
And we're talking about a Nobel laureate in physics.
Exactly. So we can see there are problems there, and amongst the many problems is, was the person in the right mood to be tested on particular days? What errors are there? And the further and further one goes up the scale, people have developed all sorts of batteries, but those batteries have their own problems, and their problems in terms of culture dependence and who has cultivated what the correct scores are. And then, of course, if you take even just a level like 1 in 1,000, you can't just base it on 10,000 people. You'd only have 10 at that level. So you've got to have a very, very large variation. And in fact, then there are questions of, if you're normalizing intelligence, what is the relevance of the people you're testing. So if there's a little bit of psychiatric disorder, if they are taking medications, what do they do there? And I had the opportunity to be, as far as I know, the only outside consultant in terms of intelligence measuring on the latest Wechsler adult intelligence scale as well as the memory scale. And the reason why I was the outside consultant was being used for exactly this purpose. Who could be and who could not be included in the listings. Then you mentioned children, because you gave an example of Einstein.
Yes.
Particularly the kid comes along and takes a test at school, and there's an item they're not sure about, and they start there and they erase it and they spend 10 minutes doing it and they don't finish their test. So in a way, I'm a cynic. Before you begin, you're not talking about a statistical intelligence quotient where the normal is an IQ of 100. That's what might come out, but there might be some people who actually should have scored more, and so the norm might be a little higher than that. Now you start extending it outwards, and you have a real problem. As I said, there's a problem in terms of statistics. You haven't got enough of a sample to decide, and then there's a problem of how do you test the person? And as you go higher and higher in terms of these scales, and these high-level batteries, I become more and more cynical about how valuable these tests are.
Well, tests like the Wechsler scale you mentioned, and I suppose the Stanford-Binet IQ test have been around for many, many decades. They've tested, I suppose, by now millions of people, so they have a big database to work with.
Yes, and of course there are problems that occur. For example, there is the Flynn effect, and there are all sorts of debates in relation to Professor Flynn's description of whether or not a person tested, let's say 50 years ago, was at a disadvantage compared with now, or are people just becoming, so to say, cleverer?
Because the Flynn effect shows that from generation to generation, IQs are jumping at an enormous rate.
Exactly. And so one starts saying what's going on. And it might well be the test, because when you start looking at comparisons, it doesn't look right. So that's one example. You use Stanford-Binet, and obviously many of the Stanford-Binet measures have been based on children. And children's scores at one point in time, as you know, people were even using things like mental age divided by chronological age. And in fact, this needs a major correction, and somebody like Scoville has described a Scoville correction which might be problematic in and of itself. And of course, there are differences, again, statistically in standard deviations, 15, 16, and there are even tests that use standard deviations of 24. So there are real variants.
Well, I guess it's fair to say, to summarize this part of our discussion, that IQ testing is a mess.
It is, to a large degree, a mess. It gives some index of how one is doing, but one should not idolize it, and one should take into account the fact that there are errors, and the further one moves away from the curve, the further the errors, and one ought to take into account other factors as well.
Well, let's talk about genius for a moment, and the distinction between genius and IQ might be a good starting point.
Yeah. It's so fascinating to me, because every so often I encounter particularly mothers who come along, and I see the child, I see the adolescent, and, you know, turns out they are of average intelligence, they are of normal intelligence, and the mother comes along and is most upset and says, Doctor, don't you know my son, little Johnny, is a genius? And I say, yes, Mrs. Smith, your son, little Johnny, is a genius. He's an average genius, because if you look at humans, isn't it astonishing how well they can perform? And your little Johnny is an average genius. And the reason why I'm introducing it in this sense is clearly there are enormous variations in terms of interpretations of what genius is. Yeah. To me, it is something that is very, very restricted, and there are not many geniuses around. Mm-hmm. You can talk about somebody who is gifted, say is at the 2 standard deviation above a normal, which is slightly below, say, the Mensa level of 1 in 50. Mm-hmm. You can talk about somebody who might be very gifted, and I sometimes use the term exceptional intelligence there, and I've spoken about the 1 in 1,000 level. Mm-hmm. And the true outside limits, as I see, of most measures of intelligence based on even some of these higher IQ batteries might be something in the region of 1 in 1,500. Mm-hmm. Although if people score beyond that, one can maybe go to the level of even 1 in 30,000. And these were starting points that I started to use because I wanted to try to understand exceptional creative achievement. Mm-hmm. I wanted to try to understand adults with exceptional creative achievement, prodigies in terms of children who might be able to perform at that level, and how could I measure these without getting into the conundrum of, yes, they can do this kind of mathematics, or they have this kind of musical skill, or they can play chess at a certain level, or they're extremely artistic. And how does one measure these? And so I had to try and find some kind of fabric in this regard that would allow one to measure this.
I should mention, for benefit of our viewers, that you have created an organization for people with exceptional creative accomplishments.
Yes, and all 3 of those words are good ones. Mm-hmm. The Exceptional Creative Achievement Organization, which is ECAO.us. Mm-hmm. There are other variants of it as well that come through there. But yes, I have created this. I created it in a way from a frustration point of view, but also from a relevance perspective. So I'll just clarify this a little bit. Mm-hmm. That word exceptional means exceptional intelligence, and generally one's dealing with people where our criteria is at least 1 in 5,000, except because of this very big standard error that you might have, where somebody could score at that level and should not really be in that organization. We sometimes look at scores that are at the 1 in 30,000 level, but knowing there's this enormous variation as you go upwards in time. So we have exceptional intelligence. The second thing is exceptional creative achievement, and one has to have measures of creativity. Now, the measures of creativity is not, well, he can do this or he can do that on particular tests. One has to have achievement that demonstrate that the person has been creative. Now, one component of it might relate to education as well, and there are a variety of different criteria that we use, but basically we're using people who have doctorates in one area or another, or they might be equilibrated because there's a scoring system where they have 2 master's degrees. And thirdly, the achievement, and this has to be creative achievement. Now, I didn't create this organization to satisfy people's egos. I created it because I realized that there was a need out there, that major companies sometimes need thinkers who are out of the box, who are creative, of exceptional intelligence, have the education to go with it, and they might want to hire them. And so potentially they might want to sponsor this non-profit corporation and hire those who are members, and that is kept pretty secret, except the people who are members can list that membership if they want to within their curriculum vitae. There's one more thing in that ECAO which I think is extremely important, and that is ethics. They have to have the highest level of ethics, and that ethics includes, can they perform if somebody hires them, which means that if they cannot perform over an extended period of time in a particular fabric, they would be excluded. So this is the Exceptional Creative Achievement Organization. And it is probably more difficult to join because I've seen the fabrics of other organizations than any other so-called exceptional intelligence organization.
Now, as you know, I did a 10-year case study of a man with unusual psychokinetic abilities, Ted Owens, and wrote a book about him called The PK Man. He was a member of Mensa, which is probably the most well-known of the high IQ organizations.
Yeah, it's well-known, but just take into account that 1 in 6 graduates with, say, a bachelor's degree would be at the level of Mensa. So I don't regard it as an exceptional IQ organization, but it does reflect the fact that the person is intelligent.
But on the other hand, you have people, I think, who sometimes make very significant achievements in life and are of average intelligence, but they've managed to make good decisions for themselves.
Very much so. And people can make good decisions of any level of intelligence. As I said at the start, yes, little Johnny Smith might be an average genius, so to say, in that kind of context. So everyone has their creative spark, their ability potentially to light that fire and to extend it until it becomes a massive flame. But it does not make them a so-called genius, but they can achieve it. They do achieve. And we've got to make sure that if we're using this term genius, these people can achieve as well. And that requires certain skills and a skill set that is culturally appropriate. You know, Leonardo da Vinci, clearly a great, great genius, a great polymath genius, or let us say somebody who had exceptional skills across several different areas. But, you know, he might develop the prototype of an aeroplane, but nobody's ready for it in the time of Leonardo. So we've got to look at skills and achievement within the context of culture as well. And it doesn't require a certain geniality to do that. It requires very often the ability to run against the waves, so to say, to swim against those waves and to perform even in the face of significant opposition, which the genius will very often have.
Well, it sounds as if what you're saying is, I did an interview recently about cultural trances, that we go through life as if we're hypnotized most of the time by our culture. We accept things for granted that our culture conveys to us, often unconsciously, as if we're in a trance state. In fact, my guests believe we literally are in a trance state much of the time. But the genius, it would seem, has the ability to wake up from the trance.
Yeah. You know what's interesting is if I had to portray certain of the features of genius, one of those is what you're portraying. And one can use all sorts of terms. Some people get upset with those terms, but let us say that people have epiphanies, or they have intuitive awarenesses, or they might even, you use the word wake up, get ideas while asleep, so to say, you use the phrase dream state. Let's call it a dream state. I'm not using myself as an example here, not directly anyway, but I will say that a lot of the discoveries that my colleague, Dr. Edward Close, and I have made.
In your book, Reality Begins with Consciousness,
yes,
for
Reality
example.
Begins with Consciousness. And there's several other books. There are 11 plus books that I've written. But a lot of this has occurred at night while asleep. In fact, I sometimes say, I'm going off to do potential work. And my potential work is while asleep. And then I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I'll have an idea. And my wife will say, "Oh, you've got an idea?" And I'll say, "Yes, I'm just going to quickly write it down. I'll be back in a minute." Well, after 2 hours, she will arrive and she'll bring me some tea and I will be working on my computer. And 5 hours later, it will be beautiful morning. And she'll come and say, "But you didn't drink my tea." And I'll say, "What tea?" Because I will have been so much involved. Now, this is not me. This is extending my consciousness. And I'm trying to get across this idea of, call it intuition, call it epiphany, call it certain insights. But it is insights that I think have gone beyond one's own brain. And you are using outside consciousness in some kind of way to develop this. And if we look at this historically, all the way going back to Archimedes, Eureka, Eureka, I have it.
Yes.
There is this moment of epiphany that we see that is reflecting a major exceptional creative achievement.
Well, I can say in my own case, not that I claim to be a genius, but my life has been shaped by insights that came to me in dreams. And I would even go so far as to say I was guided by dreams. But there are many examples. Thomas Edison, I understand, would take frequent naps in his laboratory, and he'd wake up from the nap and have an idea for another invention.
Right. And it's very interesting because, again, I'm just putting myself as an example, not because of anything except that I know myself well. I will come along and I will have something I'm trying to solve, and I'll think about it, and I'll wake up, and then the solution becomes far clearer. So this is one of the components that one is talking about. Certainly the intuition, insightful epiphany component that I think is a key in terms of interpreting. I'm using that phrase, exceptional creative achievement, because then I'm avoiding at this point in time definitions pertaining to genius, which perhaps we can discuss.
But it seems as if what you're getting at is that oftentimes the great creative breakthroughs come from a level separate from the conscious mind, from the ego, and one needs to be at least open to that when it happens.
Of course, yes.
That the human consciousness is vastly greater than we normally imagine it to be.
That's right. Yes, it is. And this is something that's very, very important. And you see, sometimes people think, well, I've been able to develop this or invent it, but they've gone from step A to step B to step C. But they didn't develop the step A initially. They used it. And the second time round, it's much, much easier. It becomes obvious when somebody else has done something, how you can apply that something. And this is something a little different. But let's just shift towards that concept of what I regard as genius and the concept of what I regard as prodigies, and the concept possibly of what I regard as polymaths.
Well, Isaac Newton said at one time, if I've accomplished things in my life, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants.
Which is an interesting one. But that, look, Newton, there's no doubt he was a genius. But if you stand on the shoulders of giants, That's fantastic, but you're not necessarily going to need to be a genius to stand on those shoulders, because already some of that creative insight, and this is one of the factors that I think is extremely important and people have neglected. You know, they'll come along and they'll talk about Spearman and so-called the general factor of intelligence, and then they might say, well, they have certain specific attributes, the specific factor of intelligence, and this is very nice as we were measuring it, but it's not genius. And if you're standing on shoulders, you're applying some of these things, but that does not require genius either. Genius requires a certain strength in terms of nervous system, being able to coordinate and integrate. That's the nervous system aspect. It requires a certain ego strength because you're working against all the opposition, and you sometimes have ideas that are not appropriate compared with the general culture, but you know that it fits in. So those are components that are there. And so I've listed already general intelligence, specific factors in terms of things, the creativity factor, which is extremely important, the intuitive factor, the ego strength, the nervous system integration, and the uniqueness in terms of that creativity, which is something that's important. But all of that is not sufficient.
And already you're going way beyond things that are measured in standard tests.
Exactly that. And it's all of that is not sufficient because, as I indicated, you have to have the right cultural achievement, and you've got to have what Arthur Jensen, the doyen of possibly intelligence overall, the late Dr. Arthur Jensen, described as zeal. You've got to have that achievement drive, that zeal to persist in the face of opposition.
Because it's often said, I think, especially by people of exceptional intelligence, that small-minded people are always trying to put them down.
Exactly that. And they don't even realize it because they don't have the insight in terms of things that they cannot conceptualize. We see it in mathematics. We see it in chess. An example from a chess point of view that I found very amusing was I was lucky enough at one point in time to lecture on the Fischer-Spassky chess match, the World Championship chess match. Probably the single most famous chess match. As the moves would come through, and before, I would be saying, well, Fischer is now going to play this move. And sure enough, Fischer played that move. And one of the audience came up to me afterwards and said, wow, do you know that of, let's say, the 37 moves that Bobby Fischer played, you played 35 of those moves? And I looked at him and I said, that's why I'm not Bobby Fischer. And this is the whole thing. Everything is a unit, but one's got to realize that sometimes one cannot even perceive one's own limitations because it goes beyond that in terms of those descriptions. And that description, incidentally, you can use a mnemonic to describe what I've just used, and you can see the G factor in terms of the G of geniuses, the E factor in terms of that ego strength, which also includes emotionality. Now, this is something that's important because you can have a child prodigy who performs beautifully, except that they really become compromised at a certain point in time in terms of ego strength. And this is why I used that phrase with this exceptional creative achievement organization, that the person has to be able to perform as in terms of that ethics component. And this is part of that ego strength.
In other words, do what they say they're going to do.
And be able to do it without disintegrating, short-term or long-term. The next one is that nervous system integration. You have a whole cerebral cortex, and you're integrating the information that's coming in, the executive information that's going out. And as I indicated, I think I may be wrong, but my data in terms of consciousness research and the data you've been exposed to in terms of consciousness research, and many of us have looked at, suggests strongly to me that in order to utilize one's full potential, one ought to be using, so to say, extracranial or extracerebral potential in terms of picking up information and meaning outside one's experience. So that would be one component in terms of that nervous system integration and executive expression, because it's the end point, it's not the full point. Then we have our GEN, the I, we said, is literally that insight, that inspiration, that epiphany component. That's not an I, but it's the same thing. That using of one's whole reality, GENI. The U, you might be saying, he's spoken about creativity. Where does the creativity comes in? The creativity is the uniqueness, the unique element.
Which makes it all the harder to test.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because, I sometimes say to people, what is the similarity between the eye and the ear? They say, well, that's easy. And they'll give me one explanation or two. And I'll say, I want you to list 30 or 40. And some of the audience might want to try and do that. Then we have the S, which is that specific factor, that Spearman factor in terms of a specific kind of factor.
Spearman factor?
Yeah.
What is the Spearman factor?
Well, Spearman developed different kinds of intelligence, or looking at specific intelligence in terms of measures. And
I think of Spearman as a statistician.
Right. Yeah, and so the S and the G in terms of the major the major general factors in terms of measuring intelligence and specific factors. So now we've spelt out the genius component, but we also have some other components, because that's not sufficient. That would be sufficient possibly for a prodigy, for a child who is performing well beyond their reach. And I classify prodigies into advanced prodigies. The person could perform like an adult and was age 7, remarkable. And this is not because of culture. It goes beyond it sometimes. You have one of my people I was examining, and this is a test that I developed. His father was a music teacher. And from age 4, he was taught how to play the piano and gave a concert at age 6 at school. But it's rather like learning a language. You're learning Japanese, you're learning English at an early stage. So that's very different in terms of cultural expression. And then we have other elements as well. And for example, I've mentioned the skills and the ultimate achievement factor component that go with that. And then there's the zeal. The zeal of being able to perform properly despite the opposition. And so we have this whole broader background where you can conceptualize what geniuses, so to say, are there and why they are there, and differentiate them from children who are performing. And there are not many, but there are advanced prodigies. And then there are creative prodigies. So, for example, a creative prodigy is somebody who could develop their own mathematical system aged 5 or 6.
A unique creation.
Yeah, because an adult could not do that. That would be an example of creative prodigy behavior. But remember, that creative prodigy or that advanced prodigy has to progress. And then you take into account the Einsteins of the world, and several of these people certainly were not prodigies at an early age. So being a prodigy or not being a prodigy does not exclude being a genius.
No, I gather that Einstein was thought to be retarded.
And this is not uncommon, because if you're busy thinking in a different kind of way, people might not understand you. You might go off to kindergarten and be exposed to the first card, and you get a call a week later, the mother's called and told, you better take away little Johnny because he's retarded. Oh no, my little Johnny is a genius. And this time little Johnny is a genius. What's the problem? Well, we gave him the 0+0 card, and he cannot get through it. And the mother goes along and explains to little Johnny that 0+0 still equals 0. And little Johnny says, no, it equals 2 noughts. And then the mother has to explain the whole concept of nothingness and somethingness. And little Johnny goes back to kindergarten, and he has been very advanced, so he started at age 3, and a week later the mother gets a call, you better take out little Johnny. And the mother says, but he's not retarded, he's brilliant. And they say, yes, we know. He's gone through our whole kindergarten syllabus in a week, and we cannot teach him anything else. And that same person might have developed his own system of mental multiplication at age 5. And then suddenly find himself doing, say, 6th grade arithmetic at that same age and getting 100% for it. So it's interesting. Now that one component would be an advanced prodigy. The other component of developing a system of mental multiplication would be a creative prodigy. And so these things differentiate these features. The uniqueness is something that's extremely important.
I know in my case, I don't consider myself a genius, but I did have a very high mathematical aptitude. And I know that in the 3rd grade, they nearly flunked me out because I refused to do the homework, which was, long division and multiplication. And I just thought it was boring.
That's exactly, and this is one of the problems that people sometimes encounter. They are boring, or you use the example of mathematics. There are several steps. And at that point in time in 3rd grade, you might be doing, so to say, arithmetic. And there's step A, B, C, D, E, and eventually you get to F and you put in the answer and you give the teacher all these different steps. Now, some of these people might not have needed to go from step A to step F. It's obvious they would go from step A and jump to F, and then the teacher would say, wait a minute, where's all your steps? And they'd have to work backwards to try and find the steps that others were requiring. So all of these led to my saying, hold on, how can we truly measure genius? How can we truly measure prodigies? Now, prodigies, therefore, were only a subgroup. But I was able to find a subgroup of people who had performed exceptionally as children. And I developed a test called the Chicsch, the standardized, corrected, historical IQ. So we have Chicsch, SCHIQ. And I could only apply this to children who had performed very, very well. And the nice part about it is I could compare this performance to the performance of adults. And taking an adult to, say, age 15, I've come across people who try and work on this mental versus chronological age. And so they take the adult, as they take, they perform at the age of a 22-year-old. Look at how they could be. And they were only 10. And they try and say, well, that must be an IQ of 220, which of course is completely wrong because there are corrections that they'd have to take into account. And probably 15 is a nice cutoff. But in any event, when you start doing this, you can interview the person. And they can give you indices of this is what I was doing at this age, this is what I was doing at that age. The more indices they have, the more accurate this is. You then take a group of people, say 3 referees, who are extremely experienced in terms of exceptional intelligence, and you give them blindly these different items and say, how would this score? So, for example, if at age 16, the person was playing, say, 7 or 8 people blindfold simultaneously in chess, that is an unusual enough ability to actually have been a world record in the 19th century. And you score that. And you go through and you score on as many items as you can, all blindly, and you have your 3 different raters. And we did this, and strange enough, the 3 different raters correlated extremely, extremely well with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly you get scores which would be their chic scores.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it doesn't apply to Einstein if he was a slow starter, so to say, but it does apply to a lot of other people.
Yeah.
And what one notices is these people can either fall down or they can achieve later on. And you only look at people in terms of, for example, that ECAO group. One subpopulation might have been a group of prodigies, but who was still performing appropriately. And that's why the PhD or the equivalent of a doctorate might be something relevant. But one can therefore develop ideas pertaining to exceptional creative intelligence or achievement where you're not worrying about, well, you know, is it right to talk about the difference or similarities between the eye and the ear? Is it right to just measure the person based on standardized IQ testing where one's really way out if one's scoring at, say, an IQ of 147, standard deviation 15, where there might be in their whole battery of people 2 in that whole group? How do you measure it? And using high-level batteries where people come along and say, well, is this culture fair? Is this dependent? Or some of these people who score very, very well are the ones who develop those tests. They don't even realize there are alternative answers, and the higher you go, the more alternative answers you've seen. I've seen batteries of tests where there could be 6 different correct answers. And one sees this in multiple choice tests as well, all the time.
All the time. Now, Vernon, you and I both have an interest in parapsychology and psychical research, and you've talked about this uncanny ability to access things that aren't available to normal consciousness. Is there any effort, or do you have any insights about how the science of parapsychology could be integrated into our study of IQ and genius?
Wonderful question. Let me just throw in one more component. I don't like the term parapsychology. I've indicated that to you.
Yes.
I prefer consciousness research, which is broader. So how do we integrate consciousness research? Stage 1 is realizing that we just have a little brain. Stage 2 is realizing there's this whole aspect of information and meaning that is outside that little brain.
Yes.
And therefore, to me, yes, there are major insights in terms of being able to use one's whole skill, which is going beyond that brain, integrating information. It might be information that comes from others, living, deceased, who knows what. Or it might be information in that whole broader repository. Sometimes people have used terms like, I think Laszlo certainly spoke about Akashic fields.
The Akashic field, yeah.
And all of these, one puts together, one allows oneself an expansion of awareness, a realization that this is something that is far, far beyond just what's in one's brain. And so if you're using psi in some kind of way, and I'm using that word psi as a generic term in terms of, again, 2 terms I don't like, so-called extrasensory perception and so-called psychokinesis in its variants. If you are applying psi and you are getting, boom, a flash of insight, and you remember that intuition that I spoke about, that epiphany, this is all applying psi. It's the same kind of thing as I see it.
Is there any effort to measure it, to train for it, to incorporate it somehow into our educational system?
I don't think there's an effort there, but I think there is a subpopulation of people who are so-called, and again, I'm using this in quotation marks, psychics.
Yeah.
So I call them subjective paranormal experience, so that it's a non-prejudicial term. Subjectively, they are having experiences which they will interpret as paranormal, subjective paranormal experience, IENTS, experience. And these people, you can then come along and use criteria for subjective paranormal experiences and say, these are 9 different categories. How many have they achieved? And you could look at criteria for veridicality. In other words, they had a dream about something that was about to happen, and they told somebody else, they recorded it, so there was some verifiability to it, and you can look at subjective verifiability. Now extend all of this, suddenly you have a study, because you can compare it with non-experience. And as you do, I did exactly that in some work with the temporal lobe of the brain. I did exactly that to some degree with my subjective paranormal experience group in the associated with subjective paranormal déjà vu as a subtype. Now, again, it's a non-prejudicial term. I'm not saying they are having these, but you asked me, how can you measure it? This would be one way of measuring it, and we could maybe use that subpopulation of people who are using their intuition, their awareness, their insights, maybe extending their broader consciousness.
Let me ask you another question, though, related to that, which is that, as I recall in our discussions of subjective paranormal experience and temporal lobe volatility, that this is often correlated with people who have had traumatic experiences in childhood. And there's often a connection between artistic genius and various forms of psychopathology and trauma. So it would seem to me to be a successful genius in society, one needs to overcome that.
One might have to in that kind of context. And one finds that there are some who actually exhibit what has been labeled, and I'm using the word labeled because I'm very cynical about current psychiatric classifications, but they might have been labeled bipolar. And one finds that during phases, certainly of hypomania, where they weren't completely psychotic and requiring, say, hospitalization and could not distinguish between real and unreal, but certainly phases of extreme activity where they didn't need to sleep and where they had this enormous mental acuity. A lot of people who might have been bipolar could have achieved during manic or hypomanic episodes what they could not under other circumstances. So certainly there's an extension there. I'm not trying to restrict things. Just one other component that's worthwhile mentioning here, I mentioned the idea of the polymath. And you can differentiate out some people, some great geniuses who were not polymaths, and some would argue that they were.
A polymath is a person with great accomplishments in many different areas.
Yes, exactly that. That doesn't mean to say they're geniuses. They've got to conform to this definition that I gave you of geniuses, and there are not too many in the world who conform to that.
And not only that, I would think that our culture doesn't do well in terms of accommodating polymaths.
Oh, it's extremely difficult for some polymaths. Because why are you researching this and this and this and this and doing different things? There's some people who could be described as having 21 different major groups of accomplishments in terms of being able to perform in different ways and have published, not only published, but published internationally and lectured in those different areas. And those people going to a university system in one department, well, you know, I want you to do research on X, and it might be on the amount of polysaccharide in the distal phalanx of one's right little finger of a dinosaur. And that is what their whole life consists of, and they know that. And they can't think more broadly. So
because we emphasize specialization maybe too much.
Yeah. And, a young patent clerk in Switzerland in 1905 was just lucky enough to have a Max Planck who recognized Albert Einstein's remarkable skills and productivity in a particular way. And that became a golden year, obviously, for him. Mm-hmm. But that does not make him a polymath. Yeah. On the other hand, you find that there is certainly a Leonardo who's a polymath, or a Maimonides, or a Leibniz, and they extend across in many different ways. Yeah. So that's just one more differentiation here.
Yeah. Well, Vernon, we've been talking for quite a while about the wonderful subject of geniuses and creativity and exceptional IQ. I know we could keep going on for a long time, but I think for now we've kind of exhausted the subject in terms of this interview. Thank you so much, Vernon.
It's my absolute pleasure, Jeff, and it's a pleasure also having this audience.
Yes, and thank you, audience, for being with us.
It's only one difference. I don't think we've exhausted the subject. We've touched it a tiny bit.
A tiny bit. Well, perhaps we'll return to it again someday.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you, and thank you.